Why was everyone suddenly silent? The air inside the Combat Information Center felt dense, electric, as if every breath carried static. You could hear the faint hum of the ship's reactor, the distant thrum of ocean waves battering the steel hull, and the disciplined clicks of fingers over consoles, until the voice cut through it all. "That's a restricted area, ma'am. I don't know what department you're with, but the custodial staff finished their sweep an hour ago. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words landed like a slap, sharp, dismissive, heavy with self-importance. Commander Rex Thorne didn't whisper. He projected, he always did, every word built to be heard by others. That tone of a man who believed command was a performance. The bridge crew froze mid-task. The junior officers, the radar techs, even the ensign stationed near the diagnostic monitors felt the weight of the moment. A collective shift, boots tightening, back straightening, eyes carefully avoiding the scene forming in the center of the room. At the far end of the CIC, a woman stood facing the main tactical display. She wore a simple gray contractor's jumpsuit, plain enough to make her invisible in the sea of blue uniforms. Her posture was unassuming, her back slightly curved over a small data slate she held delicately in her hand. She looked like an inspector, or maybe some technician sent to log equipment performance. Ordinary, forgettable. But there was something strange about the way she didn't move. She didn't flinch at his tone, didn't react at all. Her stillness wasn't defiance, it was composure, complete control. Commander Thorne took another step closer, enjoying the weight of his own voice as it filled the room. "Hello, did you hear me? This is the nerve center of a multi-billion-dollar warship, not a public library. That access badge, what is that level 4? That gets you to the mess hall and the laundry, not the command bridge." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. The kind that come when fear meets authority, when laughter becomes survival. The woman still didn't turn. Her fingers tapped the slate once, slow and deliberate, then silence. Rex's jaw tightened. To him, she was nobody, a contractor who had wandered where she didn't belong. He was the tactical action officer of the USS Vigilance, a destroyer newly fitted with cutting-edge systems and the pride of Fleet Command. He had graduated top of his class at Annapolis, earned 2 commendations during simulation campaigns, and thought himself the rising star of the Atlantic Group. This woman was an inconvenience. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice but keeping it performative enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not going to ask again. You are interfering with a critical pre-deployment diagnostic. Now, turn around, hand me that slate, and escort yourself off my bridge before I have the master-at-arms do it for you." The woman didn't move. From her chair on the raised platform, Captain Eva Rostova observed quietly. She'd seen Thorne's type before, brilliant on paper, brittle under pressure. A man more fluent in hierarchy than humanity. But something about the woman's stillness unsettled her. Rostova frowned. It wasn't the stillness of fear or confusion. It was deeper, measured. She held that slate like a pianist holds an instrument, precise, practiced. Rostova blinked. A faint memory stirred. That grip. Not the way civilians held their tablets. No, this was specific. A style taught years ago in War College, part of an old strategic program for stability in high-maneuver analysis. A style no one used anymore. She leaned forward, studying the woman more closely. Rex Thorne, meanwhile, had decided to make his moment count. He extended his hand, ready to seize the woman's shoulder to make an example of her. But the air shifted first. The calm, synthesized voice of the ship's central computer sliced through the tension. "Attention on deck. Initiate Aegis combat simulation. Omega-7, threat profile, red horizon authorization. CNO Atlantic Fleet Command. Execution begins in 30 seconds." The words hit like an electric current. Every officer froze. A cold wave swept through the CIC. Omega-7. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone knew the legend. The unwinnable scenario, the Navy's ghost drill, designed not to measure victory but to measure collapse. Rex's hand hovered midair, forgot, his face drained of color. He snapped his head toward the main display. Omega, what? The countdown appeared on the central screen, 30, 29, 28. He turned, panicked. Comms verify the authorization code. Navigation confirm the data stream. Weapons stand by all VLS, now. No one moved fast enough. The crew scrambled, the quiet room exploding into movement. But the orders were a mess, reactive, frantic, uncoordinated. Thorne was shouting, but his tone betrayed him. Too loud, too high, too desperate. He barked commands that made no sense. Launch SM-3s at the sizzlers. No countermeasures. Hard to port. Bring the radar online. The tactical display erupted in red icons. Hostile signatures everywhere. Missiles inbound. Torpedoes rising from below. Electronic warfare jamming across all frequencies. The ship's artificial intelligence spoke again, cold and mechanical. Multiple inbound threats detected. Bearing 090. Initial wave of 32 SS and 27 Sizzler missiles. Time to impact, 180 seconds. Bearing 180. Submerged contact, presumed Kula-class submarine launching Type 53 torpedoes. Concurrent U attack detected. Aegis network compromised. VLS cells 7, 9, 12 showing ghost signals. Launch authority compromised. A nightmare, a symphony of destruction unfolding across the bridge. Rex froze, his training fractured beneath the impossible flood of data. He tried to think anything, any countermeasure, but his mind blanked. He turned to his subordinates, his eyes wild. Launch everything we have. A young ensign at the U console looked up, pale. Sir, we can't. The jamming's inverted our radar frequency. If we fire, we'll paint ourselves as the target. Rex didn't answer. He didn't know how. The crew was watching him, watching their commander disintegrate in real time. Every second stretched into eternity. The simulated ship's hull integrity numbers began to fall on the secondary screen. 90%, 75, 50. Captain Rostova felt the heat of the moment press behind her eyes. She didn't intervene yet. She wanted to see who would act. And that's when the sound began. Soft, deliberate. Tapping. The rhythmic whisper of keystrokes, quick but controlled. Every head turned. The woman in the gray jumpsuit had moved to a small, forgotten diagnostic console near the port side bulkhead. Her back was to them again, but her hands were alive. The screen before her pulsed with streams of green code. She's at a dead terminal, one lieutenant muttered. That console doesn't even have command authority. But then something impossible. On the main screen, a single line of text appeared. Manual command override detected. Ghost signals vanished from the VLS display. A new icon flashed green, network integrity restored. The crew stared. Rex's mouth fell open. She was rewriting the simulation, no, not rewriting, outsmarting it. Her fingers danced across the keyboard in a rhythm that didn't seem humanly possible. There was no panic, no wasted motion, only precision. She identified the enemy's jamming frequency, inverted its waveform, and reflected it back into the ether, blinding the missiles that had been tracking them. On the holographic map, a third of the inbound icons veered wildly off course, their signals scattering like broken glass. She didn't stop. With the primary sonar jammed, she rerouted power to the hull's acoustic stress sensors, hardware meant to detect microfractures, not torpedoes. She used them to triangulate the incoming subsurface contacts. Then she fed that data directly into the CIWS turret array, manual targeting, no AI assistance. The turrets adjusted, their virtual barrels swiveling down instead of up, unleashing high-velocity rounds into the simulated water. 2 torpedoes gone, 1 left. The computer screamed, "Impact in 10 seconds." She didn't hesitate. She rerouted the ship's fire suppression system, venting halon gas along the port side. Thousands of gallons burst outward, displacing the water's density. The torpedo nose-dived under the ship. The CIC went silent again. The only sound was her typing. Then the coup de grace. She opened a manual override into the Spy 1D radar array, something no one was supposed to touch during a simulation. She pushed the emitter's power beyond safety limits, focusing the full beam into a narrow cone of microwave energy. The remaining missile icons blinked, one by one, into nothing. The alarm stopped. On the display, white text appeared. Simulation complete. Result, flawless victory, 0 casualties. Time elapsed, 97 seconds. No one breathed. The woman lowered her hands, a quiet inhale, shoulders rising, falling. Then stillness again. For a long moment, the only sound aboard the USS Vigilance was the low hum of systems returning to idle. Captain Rostova finally rose from her chair. She understood now. That stillness earlier, it wasn't defiance. It was depth. It was mastery so complete that noise became irrelevant. The hatch hissed open behind her. Rostova stepped onto the bridge floor. Every pair of eyes followed her. The woman in gray turned slowly to face her, her expression serene. No pride, no arrogance. Rostova stopped a few feet away, spine straight, voice firm but quiet. "Admiral," she said. The word rippled through the crew like an earthquake. Rex Thorne's eyes widened in disbelief. The woman simply looked at Rostova. "The element of surprise," she said softly, "is the entire point of the exercise, Captain." And for the first time, every soul in that room understood what real authority sounded like. It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It simply was. He didn't move. None of them did. For several heartbeats, the bridge of the USS Vigilance remained frozen, a tableau of disbelief. The hum of electronics seemed distant now, almost reverent, as though even the ship itself understood that something extraordinary had just unfolded. Commander Rex Thorne's throat tightened. His brain tried to process what his eyes refused to believe. Admiral, Fleet Admiral, that gray jumpsuited woman he'd been seconds from physically removing was now the highest-ranking naval officer any of them would ever stand before in their lives. The words replayed in his head, circling like vultures. "You are interfering with a critical diagnostic." He'd spoken them to her. A tremor rippled through him, not of fear but of humiliation. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, suffocating, the kind of shame that made the air feel too heavy to breathe. Captain Rostova broke the silence first. She turned toward the holographic personnel console, her voice calm but cold, stripped of all pretense. "Crew of the Vigilance," she said, every syllable clear. "You are standing in the presence of Fleet Admiral Evelyn Hayes." Her tone carried not ceremony, but warning. Rex's stomach sank. Evelyn Hayes. He knew that name. Everyone in the fleet did. But it belonged to myth, to the stories cadets whispered in academy dorms when the lights went out. They called her the ghost of doctrine, the strategist who designed the frameworks that modern naval warfare stood on. She was the architect of the Ares doctrine, the network-centric strategy that reshaped how fleets thought, moved, and fought. And she had been here, in a gray jumpsuit under his nose. Rostova tapped the console. The main display flickered, showing a classified personnel file. Most of it was redacted, but enough remained visible to freeze the blood of every sailor in that room. HAYS, EVLYNM. Rank Fleet Admiral 010. Current assignment: Special Advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, Director, Red Team Operations Group. Awards: Navy Cross, Defense Distinguished Service Medal 2 OLC, Presidential Medal of Freedom. Notable contributions: Ares Doctrine, Silent Hammer, Omega-7 simulation design. The last line hit hardest. The Omega-7 simulation, the same unwinnable drill they'd just survived, had been her creation. Rostova's voice was quiet now, but it carried the sharpness of a blade. 30 years ago, as a young lieutenant at the War College, Admiral Hayes designed Omega-7. It was her final thesis. She built it to teach one thing: humility under overwhelming odds. She turned to Thorne, who stood like a ghost among the living. No one has ever beaten it. No one, until today. The words cut him in half. Every mocking chuckle he'd drawn from the crew, every ounce of pride that fueled his posturing, it all imploded in an instant. He'd cornered a legend against the wall. And she had turned his arrogance into a lesson the entire fleet would remember. Rostova stepped closer to him. Her boots rang sharply on the deck plating. "Do you know why you failed, Commander?" she asked. Her voice was soft, yet somehow it carried more weight than a shout ever could. "Because you confused command with control. Because you thought authority was something granted by a title, not proven through competence." Thorne's mouth opened, but no words came out. There was nothing to defend, no ground left to stand on. Admiral Hayes stood motionless behind them, silent as the stars beyond the hull. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable, the serenity of someone who didn't need to prove anything. She wasn't angry. She didn't gloat. She simply was. Rostova faced the crew again. "Remember this day," she said. "Remember how quickly arrogance collapses in the face of quiet mastery." Then she saluted, the kind of salute that came not from duty but reverence. Hayes did not return it. She simply inclined her head, the gesture precise, respectful, final. "The element of surprise," she murmured, "is the entire point of the exercise, Captain." Her voice was calm, but under that calm was iron. And something else, sadness maybe. A quiet fatigue known only to those who have carried command long enough to see its cost. As the tension drained, the bridge came alive again, not with chatter but with whispers. Reverent, disbelieving, hushed. Someone exhaled audibly, the sound fragile and human. Another officer muttered under his breath, "She wrote Omega-7. She beat her own creation." Thorne closed his eyes. Inside, everything fractured. His world, his pride, his image of himself, all of it burned down to ash. He had lived his entire career constructing an image. Sharp uniform, loud confidence, perfectly calibrated superiority. And now that image stood naked before the truth. Admiral Hayes didn't destroy him with rank or punishment. She destroyed him with competence, with effortless mastery that made his bluster look like noise. The humiliation was total, but beneath it, buried somewhere deep, a seed was planted. The faint, painful beginning of understanding. Hours later, the vigilance was quiet again. The simulation logs were sealed and transmitted to Fleet Command. The crew dispersed to their stations, whispering fragments of the event like fragments of myth. Rostova stood by the observation window, arms folded behind her back, watching the dark sea slide by. She had seen many simulations, many drills, but none that left this kind of silence afterward. The silence of realization, of collective humility. Admiral Hayes approached without a sound. For a moment, neither spoke. The reflection of the stars painted faint constellations across the glass, scattered across the old woman's face like distant metals. "Permission to speak freely, Admiral," Rostova said quietly. "Always." "You could have stopped him sooner," Rostova said. "You could have revealed yourself before he embarrassed himself." Hayes gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I could have, but then it wouldn't have been a lesson worth learning." Rostova turned toward her, eyes narrowing. "You set him up." "No," Hayes said softly. "I set the truth up. He just volunteered to meet it." Her tone wasn't cruel, it was weary. The voice of someone who had seen the same story too many times. Men who mistook noise for leadership. Officers who believed that power was inherited, not earned. "You've been doing this a long time," Rostova said. "Too long," Hayes murmured. Her gaze drifted toward the dim glow of the command consoles. "You know what the hardest part of leadership is, Captain?" Rostova shook her head. "It's learning to stay quiet long enough to let people reveal who they really are." The words lingered in the air, as soft as they were devastating. She turned to leave but paused. "You have a good ship, Captain, and a crew worth keeping. Don't let noise lead them." When she stepped through the hatch, Rostova realized she'd been holding her breath. The next day came with rumors. They spread like wildfire through the decks and corridors, passed in whispers between sailors and techs. Someone called it the Admiral's Gambit. Others named it the lesson of Omega-7. The story traveled faster than official memos, rewritten, exaggerated, and mythologized with every retelling. By sundown, officers on destroyers across the Pacific were repeating the tale of a loud commander who cornered a quiet woman and learned she was the ghost who wrote the impossible test. A myth was being born. And in the center of that myth, the woman herself sat quietly in the mess hall, surrounded by enlisted crew, eating scrambled eggs and coffee like everyone else. She didn't speak much, only listened, nodding when someone shared a story about their first deployment or a family waiting back home. No one dared ask her about the simulation. No one needed to. Her presence was enough. Rex Thorne avoided the mess entirely. He couldn't face them, not the glances, not the whispers. Every time someone's eyes lingered too long, shame flared through him like fire under his skin. He spent hours alone in his quarters, replaying every detail, every word he'd said, every look, every laugh that followed his mockery. It was all there, a perfect record of his failure. But in the middle of that pain, something new began to take shape. Not anger, not defensiveness, something harder, more honest. Reflection. He thought of how she moved, how she had taken control of chaos without raising her voice, how she had seen what no one else could see, how she'd turned disaster into order without a single command. It wasn't magic. It was mastery born from decades of discipline. And he realized how small he'd been. He'd believed leadership was performance, posture, volume, intimidation. But real command wasn't a show. It was precision under pressure. It was vision. It was the ability to see the whole board when others saw only pieces. He had mistaken sound for substance. As the hours passed, he sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the silent walls, his own reflection dimly visible in the polished bulkhead. For the first time in his career, Rex Thorne didn't feel like a commander. He felt like a student. Some lessons come in classrooms, others come like storms. He had just weathered his. 2 days later, Admiral Hayes prepared to depart. There was no ceremony, no official send-off. That wasn't her way. She packed her slate and left the same way she had arrived, quietly, efficiently, as though she'd never been there at all. Captain Rostova met her at the hangar bay. The crew stood at a respectful distance, silent. "Before you go," Rostova said, "the crew started calling that auxiliary console the Admiral's chair. I'm thinking of adding a plaque." Hayes looked at it, the simple, unremarkable workstation tucked in the corner. A faint smile touched her lips. "Don't name it after me," she said softly. "Name it the quiet console. Let it remind them that the most powerful voice in any room isn't always the loudest." Then she boarded the shuttle, her gray jumpsuit catching the early sunlight, and disappeared into the sky. That night the vigilance was quieter than usual. The crew worked with new focus, new stillness. They spoke less, listened more. The ship itself seemed to hum differently, not louder, not softer, but clearer. Competence had become their creed. Silence, their shared language of respect. And though her presence was gone, the echo of her lesson remained. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It simply stands still, and everyone else learns to listen. The sea was calm that morning, but the ship was. Not really. The vigilance had changed. You could feel it in the way people walked its corridors, slower, steadier, deliberate. The chatter that used to fill the decks had quieted, replaced by something heavier, something sharper. Awareness. In the control room, you could almost sense the ghost of the simulation lingering, like the echo of a storm that had already passed, but left the air charged with static. For Captain Eva Ristova, that silence was a blessing. For Commander Rex Thorne, it was a sentence. He could feel it in every sideways glance, every polite nod that ended a second too soon. No one mocked him. No one dared. That was somehow worse. Pity had replaced respect, and pity in the military was poison. He'd been officially removed from tactical duty within 12 hours of the incident. No reprimand, no public scolding, just a short message stamped personnel reassignment pending. The kind of bureaucratic language that hides mercy inside humiliation. He told himself it didn't matter, but he knew it did. Every officer lives for relevance, for that moment when the room turns to them for answers. Now, the room avoided him. He'd become the ghost of his own bridge. Rex spent most of his time in the observation bay, staring at the endless horizon. He told himself he was studying weather patterns, but really, he was studying stillness, trying to understand how a person like Admiral Hayes could command so much without saying almost anything at all. He could still see her in his mind, the calm posture, the rhythm of her typing, the way her presence filled the space without dominating it. She didn't lead by demanding attention. She earned it by giving none to herself. He wondered how many years it took to become that kind of quiet. Down on Deck 4, the mess hall buzzed with low conversation. Admiral Hayes sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. Around her, sailors spoke in careful tones, not afraid, just reverent. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was short, practical, and somehow unforgettable. A young sonar tech, nervous but curious, finally asked the question everyone else was too afraid to. "Admiral," he said softly, "did you know it was going to play out like that?" She looked up, her eyes kind but steady. "No one ever knows how it's going to play out," she said. "That's the point of testing leadership under pressure. You find out who people really are when the script falls apart." The young sailor nodded, trying to absorb wisdom that felt both simple and enormous. Hayes sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting toward the far wall. "Most people think failure is the end of something," she added. "But sometimes it's just the start of finally learning." She didn't look at anyone in particular when she said it. But every sailor in that room thought of Commander Thorne. That afternoon, Captain Ristova found her in the CIC again. Hayes stood alone at the auxiliary console, the quiet console, fingers moving with that same gentle precision, as though memory itself was a language only she could read. "Running diagnostics again, Admiral?" Ristova asked. "Running reflection," Hayes replied without looking up. "I like to see where the systems break before the people do." Ristova smiled faintly. "You've left quite a mark here." "Marks fade," Hayes said. "Habits last, that's what matters." She turned then, studying Ristova with eyes that saw far more than they revealed. "Tell me about your crew," she said. "Who's worth watching?" Ristova hesitated, then answered. "The ensign on the Yale console, the one who noticed the feedback loop during the simulation. Bright kid. Quiet." Hayes nodded. "Quiet is good. Quiet means thinking." There was a pause, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then Hayes asked the question that caught Ristova off guard. "And Thorne?" The captain's brow furrowed. "He's processing. It's difficult for him." "It should be," Hayes said simply. "Shame is only useless when it turns into pride again, but if he learns to sit in it long enough, it can become understanding." "You think he'll recover?" "I think he'll remember," Hayes said. "Recovery is optional, remembering is mandatory." For a long moment, the two women stood there in the low hum of the CIC, surrounded by the ghosts of data streams and tactical charts. Outside, the sea rolled endlessly, calm but never still. Late that night, Thorne found himself wandering the empty bridge. The lights were dimmed for night ops, a faint red glow washing the consoles. He stood before the massive holographic display, now blank, and stared into its black mirror. He could see his reflection, uniform crisp, posture perfect, eyes hollow. He whispered to himself, "You cornered its creator." The words from Rostova's debrief still echoed in his skull. He had done the one thing the simulation wasn't programmed to anticipate. He had forced the creator herself to act. He wondered what she saw in him in that moment, anger, arrogance, or maybe the fear underneath all of it. Because that's what it really was, wasn't it? Fear. The fear of being ordinary, the fear of being seen as less. He rested his hand on the edge of the console, tracing its cold metal surface. The quiet console, they called it now. He gave a small, bitter laugh. "Fitting," he murmured. "You win by shutting up." But deep down, he knew that wasn't the real lesson. It wasn't about silence. It was about clarity, about cutting through the noise, the ego, the posturing, the performance, until all that was left was truth and action. He closed his eyes, took a long breath, and stood there until dawn. When morning came, Admiral Hayes made her rounds. She stopped in engineering, asked about turbine efficiency. She spent half an hour with the sonar team, listening as they explained the difficulty of distinguishing between marine life and enemy drones in shallow waters. She offered no criticism, only curiosity. Everywhere she went, she left calm in her wake. Not inspiration, not fear, just calm. The kind of calm that makes people perform better because they want to, not because they're afraid to fail. In her presence, people straightened their backs, not out of duty, out of pride. When she reached the CIC, she found the young ensign already at his console, calibrating signal filters. He stood as she approached, eyes wide, hands trembling slightly. "At ease," she said. "What's your name?" "Ensign Keller, ma'am." "You were the one who caught the feedback pattern during the simulation." "Yes, ma'am," he swallowed hard. I just noticed the wave phase looked wrong, ma'am." Hayes smiled faintly. "That's leadership, Ensign Keller, seeing what others miss and trusting it even when it feels small." He blinked. "Leadership, ma'am, I just pointed out a signal glitch." "Exactly," she said. "Big decisions grow from small observations. Command isn't about giving orders. It's about recognizing the right answer when someone else says it." Keller looked stunned for a moment, then nodded. Something changed in his posture, just a subtle straightening, as though the weight of being noticed by her carried more honor than any medal. Hayes turned to leave, then paused. "Keep listening, Keller. Most people stop listening the higher they climb." When she walked away, the young ensign looked at the quiet console. He understood now why the crew whispered its name with respect. That evening, as the sun sank low over the horizon, Hayes stood on the observation deck alone. The light painted the sea gold, rippling like liquid fire. She rested her hands on the railing, her gaze distant, not on the water but beyond it. She'd spent her entire career designing systems, doctrines, simulations, tools to teach others how to lead in chaos. But the older she grew, the more she realized leadership wasn't taught by systems. It was taught by moments like these, quiet, painful reckonings between pride and humility. She thought of Thorne, of how easily arrogance can crumble, of how sometimes it must. The hatch opened behind her, footsteps, slow, uncertain. "Admiral," Thorne's voice said. She didn't turn around. "Commander." "I wanted to apologize." She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. The ocean murmured below. "Do you know why people yell when they feel threatened?" she asked softly. Thorne frowned. "Because they want to be heard." "No," she said, "because they're afraid no one's listening." He said nothing. "I've seen hundreds of officers like you," Hayes continued. "Sharp, trained, perfect on paper, but somewhere along the way they start thinking leadership means always being right. It doesn't. It means knowing when you're wrong and staying calm enough to fix it." He nodded slowly. "I understand that now." "Do you?" she asked, finally turning to face him. "Understanding isn't the same as living it. Understanding lasts until the next moment you're tested." He met her eyes. There was no fear there now, only quiet resolve. "Then I'll wait for that moment," he said. She studied him for a long time, then nodded. "Good. Waiting is harder than fighting." For the first time since she'd met him, she smiled. It was small, tired, but real. When he left, Hayes turned back to the horizon. The sun was gone now, the sky deepening into violet. She whispered to herself, maybe he'll make it. Then, after a pause, maybe this time the lesson will last. That night the ship rolled through calm seas. Stars reflected on the dark water like distant memories. In the quiet of the CIC, the consoles glowed faint blue, the hum of electronics soft and steady. Captain Rostova walked the bridge in silence, listening to her crew, not their words but the rhythm of their work. Efficient, coordinated, focused. The noise was gone, the fear was gone. What remained was unity. At the quiet console, Ensign Keller worked with calm precision. Nearby, Lieutenant Ramos monitored the radar, her movements smooth and measured. Even Thorne, temporarily reassigned to observation duties, stood at the rear, quietly assisting the navigation team without being asked. Rostova exhaled slowly. The Admiral's presence was everywhere, not in orders, not in doctrine, but in the air itself. Discipline had turned into understanding. She remembered Hayes's final words before boarding her shuttle earlier that day. "Don't let noise lead them." Now she saw what that meant. When dawn broke, the Vigilance sailed east, the horizon glowing with light. Rex Thorne stood alone on deck, the wind cutting through his uniform, the sea stretching endless before him. Somewhere behind him, sailors laughed quietly, beginning another day. He closed his eyes, the sound of waves mixing with memory, the tapping of keys, the calm voice, the silence after victory. He understood now that real command wasn't loud. It wasn't about being the biggest presence in the room. It was about being the anchor in the storm. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "Stay quiet, stay steady." For the first time in his life, the words didn't sound weak. They sounded strong. He smiled faintly. The lesson was beginning to take root. And far away, in some Admiralty office overlooking the Atlantic, Evelyn Hayes received a report. Commander Rex Thorne, reassignment recommended following evaluation period. Potential for growth, high. She read it once, then signed her approval. No hesitation. No annotation. Just 3 words written neatly in the margin. He's listening now. No one really knows what silence sounds like until they're forced to live inside it. For Rex Thorne, it sounded like the rustle of paper and the soft click of data pads echoing through a warehouse. The Naval Supply Depot at Norfolk wasn't a punishment, not officially. The letter said temporary reassignment, logistical digitization oversight. But everyone who'd ever worn a uniform knew what that really meant. Exile in plain sight. A quiet purgatory for officers who'd fallen from grace. He was surrounded by rows of steel shelves stacked with forgotten parts, outdated sensors, obsolete components, crates of uniforms from 3 wars ago. The air smelled faintly of dust and oil. In here, nothing moved fast, nothing made noise. It was a world stripped of urgency, of command, of relevance. At first, he hated it. He hated the monotony, the fluorescent lights that hummed like old machinery, the endless hours staring at spreadsheets cataloging things no one cared about anymore. Mostly, he hated himself. He replayed that day over and over in his mind. Her face, her calm, the absolute control she had in the moment when his own command had collapsed into noise. He'd been proud once, too proud of his ability to command a room. But that day, she hadn't just commanded a room. She owned it without even trying. She didn't need to raise her voice or assert her rank. Her presence had done the talking. Now, surrounded by boxes instead of people, he finally had time to listen to something he'd avoided for years, his own thoughts. Every morning he came in at 600 sharp. No one told him to. Old habits die hard. He'd start by walking the aisles, clipboard in hand, his boots echoing faintly on the concrete. It wasn't a warship deck, but he treated it like one. Order, precision, discipline, he clung to them like lifelines. By mid-morning, the sun would slant through the high windows, throwing long shadows over the dusty floor. That's when it would hit him, the silence. The absence of commands, of adrenaline, of purpose. He'd stop sometimes, stare down the long corridors of shelves that stretched into infinity, and wonder how a man who once directed a warship's fire control could end up counting bolts in a storage yard. Maybe this was the test he was meant to face all along. Weeks passed. The anger faded first, burned itself out like a dying engine. Then came restlessness. Then something else, a strange, painful clarity. He started noticing the small things he used to overlook. The quartermaster's assistant, a tired woman named Phillips, had been managing the warehouse mostly alone for years, her requests for extra help buried under layers of bureaucracy. She never complained, never raised her voice, never demanded attention. She just worked, efficiently, quietly. He found himself watching her sometimes, realizing that she moved through chaos with the same quiet command Admiral Hayes had shown. No one recognized her strength. No one needed to. It was there, undeniable in the precision of her work. One morning, as she passed his station, he said quietly, "You've been here a long time." Phillips didn't look up from her clipboard. 18 years. He nodded. "Doesn't get much recognition, does it?" She smiled faintly. "Recognition's overrated, Commander. Things still have to get done whether someone's watching or not." That line hit him harder than she could have known. He heard Hayes's voice in his head again. Leadership is not about being seen. It's about seeing. For the first time, he started to understand what that meant. As months slipped by, Thorne built routines. Catalog by catalog, aisle by aisle, he digitized the chaos. He created systems where none existed. The place slowly began to transform, shipments tracked accurately, maintenance requests processed faster, errors cut down by half. It wasn't glory, it wasn't war, but it was progress, real, tangible, quiet progress. And in that stillness, humility took root. Sometimes he'd find himself staring out the depot windows, imagining the vigilance somewhere out at sea. The hum of the CIC, the soft glow of the consoles, the calm voice of Hayes whispering through the silence. He wondered what she would say if she saw him now, hunched over a terminal surrounded by crates instead of sailors. He hoped she'd understand that this time he was listening. Elsewhere, in a high-rise office overlooking the Potomac, Admiral Evelyn Hayes read the quarterly personnel review. Her reading glasses rested low on her nose, her hair tied back the same way it always was, efficient, unadorned. The file on her desk was thin, but the name printed at the top made her pause. Commander Rex Thorne, Norfolk Supply Depot. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes softened slightly. She read the notes. Performance exceptional. No disciplinary issues. Initiative taken to reorganize depot operations. Displays uncharacteristic humility and commitment to efficiency. She smiled faintly, not out of amusement but out of recognition. The words reminded her of another file, decades ago, one written about herself, after a mistake that had nearly ended her career before it began. She'd once been arrogant too, once believed intellect was the same as wisdom. The lesson had come hard and it had shaped her ever since. Hayes closed the folder, leaned back in her chair and whispered to no one, "Good. He's doing the real work now." Months turned into half a year. The depot became Thorne's new battlefield. His weapons were spreadsheets and scanners. His victories were measured in efficiency percentages and reduced error margins. He stopped checking his messages for reassignment orders. He stopped waiting for redemption to arrive from the outside. He began to build it himself. He mentored new recruits who rotated through for short logistical assignments, young sailors used to chaos and noise who treated the warehouse like a punishment. He'd teach them the basics, always the same way: calm, steady, patient. One afternoon, a young ensign asked him, "Sir, how do you stand this? It's so slow." Thorne smiled, a quiet, almost nostalgic smile. "Slow gives you time to think. Thinking gives you precision. Precision keeps people alive." The ensign blinked, then nodded. "I never thought of it like that." "Most don't," Thorne said, "until they lose something that moves faster than they do." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. His tone carried the weight of a man who'd already lived that truth. That night, as he walked back to his quarters, he realized something had shifted inside him. The silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like peace. Maybe that's what Admiral Hayes had wanted him to find, not penance, but perspective. Winter came early that year. The depot grew cold, the heating systems groaning against the wind. On one particularly gray morning, Thorne arrived to find an unmarked envelope sitting on his desk. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Commander Rex Thorne pending reassignment review. Personal evaluation scheduled at Fleet Command. Report to Washington, D.C., room 314, Monday 900 hours. He stared at it for a long moment. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. He didn't know whether to feel dread or relief. That night he packed his uniform with ritual precision. The crisp lines, the polished insignia, they all looked different now. Less armor, more honesty. When he boarded the early flight to D.C., he didn't think of redemption anymore. He just wanted to prove he'd learned something worth carrying back into the world. The elevator doors opened to reveal a long corridor lined with glass walls. Fleet Command headquarters. Every step echoed off marble. His heart thudded in time with it. At the far end, an officer waited outside a door marked 314. "Commander Thorne," the man said, checking his tablet. "You're expected." Thorne straightened his posture, smoothed his jacket, and entered. Inside, sunlight spilled through tall windows onto a simple conference room. No flags, no medals, just a single desk, and behind it, Admiral Evelyn Hayes. She looked up, that calm face again, that same unreadable stillness. For a heartbeat, the old shame came rushing back. But she didn't look at him like she had before, not as a superior confronting failure, but as a teacher waiting for her student to speak first. He saluted, "Ma'am." She returned it with a nod. "At ease, Commander." He relaxed slightly. "You requested me, ma'am." "I did." She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit." He obeyed, careful, composed. "I read your reports," Hayes said, folding her hands. "I see you've managed to reorganize an entire depot's logistics chain. Impressive work." "Just doing my duty, ma'am." Her eyes softened. "No, this time you were learning your duty." He didn't know how to respond. The words hit somewhere deep. "You were angry at first," she continued. "That's expected. Anger's just the noise that hides fear, but you stayed. You listened. You rebuilt from the ground up. That's how you measure real command." He swallowed hard. "I thought I was finished." "You were," Hayes said quietly, "and that's why you had a chance to begin." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, just honest. The kind of silence filled with unspoken respect. Finally, she reached for a folder and slid it across the desk. "The Vigilance is back on active deployment in the South China Sea. Captain Rostova requested a new tactical action officer. She didn't request you by name, but I did." He looked up sharply. "Ma'am, after everything." "After everything," Hayes said, her voice firm. "You're the only one who understands what that ship needs. Humility, composure, and clarity under fire. You earned another chance, Commander." He stared at the folder, the weight of it sinking in, not as a reward but as a responsibility. Hayes stood, stepping closer, her voice softened. "Don't waste it." He rose, meeting her gaze. "I won't." And for the first time she smiled, not faintly, not politely, but with genuine pride. "Good, because the next test won't be simulated." That night, as his transport jet roared over the Atlantic, Rex Thorne sat by the window, watching the world drift beneath him. The stars outside reminded him of the radar display on the CIC, that cold blue light, the endless black around it. He remembered her words. The most powerful voice in the room isn't always the loudest. He whispered to himself, "Then it's time to speak without speaking." For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something like hope. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. Maybe it was about walking straight through them, quietly, deliberately, and emerging changed. And far below, somewhere in the dark water of the Pacific, the USS Vigilance waited. The ship that had witnessed his greatest failure was about to see who he'd become. When the helicopter touched down on the Vigilance's deck, Rex Thorne didn't step out right away. He waited, just long enough to feel the vibration under his boots, the familiar tremor of engines thrumming through steel. The smell of salt, oil, and heated metal filled his lungs. He'd missed that smell more than he would ever admit. The crew moved with quiet precision around him, guiding supplies and fuel lines. No one looked his way. Not yet. They didn't know who he was, not really. His record said returning officer, but the ship remembered him as something else. The man who had lost control in front of the fleet admiral herself. When he finally climbed out, the wind hit him hard, sharp, cold, honest. It tore through his uniform and forced him to square his shoulders. He crossed the deck slowly, eyes tracing the horizon where the sea bled into gray cloud. Somewhere beneath those waters, a rogue submarine had already been reported, unidentified, unpredictable. The air carried tension. Inside, the familiar hum of the CIC greeted him like an old ghost. The lights, the consoles, the faint smell of ozone. It was exactly as he remembered. And yet everything felt different, calmer. Captain Rostova stood near the main display. When she turned, he caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes. Not surprise, not warmth, but understanding. "Commander Thorne," she said, "welcome back." He saluted. "Permission to come aboard, ma'am." "Granted." She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than regulation required, then nodded toward the console. "Your station's waiting." There were no snide remarks, no whispers. The bridge crew worked in silence, their motions crisp. He realized this wasn't fear, it was culture. The Admiral's culture. The quiet console stood in its corner, unoccupied, glowing faint blue in the dim light. He felt the weight of memory in that glow. Rostova's voice drew him back. "Fleet Command wants us to maintain presence in the region. Tensions are high. You'll have time to reacquaint yourself with the ship before things get interesting." Thorne gave a small nod. "Understood." She watched him for a moment. "You've changed." He met her eyes steady. "That was the point, ma'am." She allowed the faintest smile. "Let's hope the lesson holds when the shooting starts." For 3 weeks the Vigilance patrolled the South China Sea. The crew drilled constantly, simulations, intercept scenarios, electronic warfare tests. Thorne stayed quiet, observant. He no longer barked orders or tried to prove himself. He asked questions, listened to answers, and when he spoke, his voice carried weight, not because of volume but because of intent. Slowly, the crew began to see him differently. The officers who once avoided his eye now sought his input. The ensigns mirrored his tone. Even the youngest watchstanders absorbed his calm. The ship itself seemed to breathe easier. During off hours, Thorne would find himself back at the quiet console. He never touched it without reason, just stood near it, remembering the rhythm of keys, the sound of Admiral Hayes's quiet typing. He could almost hear her voice in his head, clarity under pressure. Silence is not absence, it's control. Every night, he repeated those words before sleep. Then came the morning that changed everything. At 4:20 hours, the first alarm blared through the vigilance. General quarters. Thorne was already awake. He was in the CIC within seconds, uniform half-fastened, eyes scanning the holographic display. Red icons bloomed across the map like spreading fire. Multiple inbound tracks bearing 090 through 180, the radar officer reported, voice steady but tight. Speed, Mach 3, altitude, sea skimming. Captain Rostova appeared beside him, her expression unreadable. Report. The comms officer turned pale. Ma'am, it's a full salvo, 30-plus Sizzler-class anti-ship missiles, and we're picking up submerged contacts, multiple. Submarine launch signatures confirmed. Someone whispered, "This can't be real." Thorne's eyes narrowed. The scenario was too familiar, too precise. Omega-7. The unwinnable simulation had just come to life. Rostova looked at him. Suggestions, Commander. He didn't hesitate. We don't panic. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. You analyze the jamming profile. Don't fight it, find its rhythm. It's a feedback loop, same as before. Navigation, plot torpedo approach vectors using hull acoustics, not sonar. Weapons, bring CIWS and CRAM to standby, but hold fire until I give the word. The crew moved instantly. No questions, no hesitation. His tone carried the authority of someone who had already survived this once. The holographic display filled with noise as radar returns collided with electronic interference. The computer's synthetic voice echoed through the room. Multiple threat vectors closing, time to impact, 180 seconds. The tension was suffocating, but Thorne's voice remained level. They're expecting panic. Don't give it to them. You reverse the jamming frequency. Use their own guidance systems against them. The ensign, Keller, older now, confident, typed furiously. On it, sir. Navigation. Calculate the acoustic crossfeed from our portside hull sensors. Give me target coordinates for incoming torpedoes. Aye, sir. Engineering. Reroute halon suppression to the port vent line. Prep for emergency venting on my mark. Aye. The CIC thrummed with energy. Controlled energy. Thorne moved between stations with purpose, his mind clear. This wasn't bravado. This was redemption in motion. Yield status. Phase inversion ready, Commander. Execute. The main display flickered. Half the red icons began to spiral off course, losing lock. A small murmur rippled through the bridge, disbelief giving way to hope. Navigation torpedoes. 3 inbound, range closing. Thorne's eyes flicked to the timer. Activate acoustic fire grid, target intercept vectors. The CRAM turrets roared to life, their rapid-fire rounds cutting through the water with supercavitating precision. 2 torpedoes neutralized, 1 left. Impact in 10 seconds, someone shouted. Thorne's hand hovered over the console. He didn't hesitate. Vent halon now. A deep hiss shuddered through the hull as thousands of gallons of gas erupted from the side vents. The final torpedo dove beneath the sudden pressure shift, detonating harmlessly below. A cheer started to rise, but Thorne cut it off with a raised hand. Not yet. We still have inbound missiles. 17 remaining, Keller reported. Thorne leaned forward, eyes locked on the display. He thought of her, Hayes, standing in this same room, hands a blur over the keys, her calm radiating like light. Spy 1D radar array, he said quietly. Manual override. The technician hesitated. Sir, that could overload the emitter. "I know," Thorne said. "Do it anyway." The screen filled with static as power rerouted through the emitter coils. Target elevation band 10 degrees. Focus beam to narrow field. Fire control linked to radar pulse output. "Ready." Thorne exhaled, "Sweep the sky." A blinding pulse of microwave energy surged outward. On the display, red icons winked out, one after another, until the board cleared. Silence. The alarm stopped. The only sound was the faint hum of cooling systems winding down. Rostova looked around slowly, all targets neutralized. Keller checked his readouts. "Confirmed, ma'am, 0 damage, no casualties." The words hung there, heavy and sacred. Thorne closed his eyes for a moment, his breath steady. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt whole. When he opened them again, he found Rostova watching him. For the first time since his return, she smiled, small, proud, and utterly sincere. "Commander," she said, "that was flawless." He shook his head. "It wasn't flawless, it was quiet." She nodded once. "Same thing sometimes." Hours later, the adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion and reflection. The crew gathered in the wardroom, unofficially, no ceremony, just coffee and silence. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Every face there carried the same realization. They had just lived through the impossible and survived because they had learned how to be still when the world demanded noise. Captain Rostova stood at the head of the table. "The official report will call this textbook," she said quietly. "But we know better. It wasn't textbook. It was memory. It was what she taught us." No one needed to ask who she was. Rex Thorne looked down at his hands. "Admiral Hayes," he said softly. "She beat Omega 730 years ago. Today we did it for real." The room stayed silent, but pride radiated from every set of eyes. Rostova raised her cup slightly. "To the Admiral," she said. Thorne followed, his voice low but steady. "To the quiet ones who teach us how to listen." They drank. Later, alone in the CIC, Thorne stood before the quiet console. The screens glowed faintly, the keys resting under his fingertips. He didn't touch them. He just stood there, feeling the hum beneath the metal, the pulse of the ship alive and calm. He spoke softly, as though she could hear him. "You said the next test wouldn't be simulated. You were right." He glanced at the radar display where, hours ago, chaos had burned. Now it was empty, serene. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me how to be quiet." The console blinked once, a soft flicker of light as if in acknowledgement. He smiled faintly, almost believing it was her way of answering back. He turned to leave but paused at the hatch. The crew would never fully understand what had happened that day, not the depth of it, but he did, and that was enough. Because the lesson was no longer hers. It was his now, his to live, his to pass on. And as he walked the dim corridor back to his quarters, the hum of the ship followed him, rhythmic, alive. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady. In the following days, reports flooded Fleet Command. Words like flawless execution, unprecedented coordination, impeccable leadership filled the official summaries. But none of those words captured what really mattered, that a man who once thought authority was a performance had learned to lead by listening. When Admiral Evelyn Hayes received the after-action transcript, she read it in silence, line by line, order by order. She recognized his fingerprints on every command. She closed the report slowly, her lips curving into the smallest smile. She didn't need to write an endorsement. She simply whispered, "Lesson complete." Outside her window, the city lights reflected off the Potomac like distant beacons. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the Vigilance sailed on, quiet, confident, alive. The fleet had changed that day, and maybe so had she. Because even teachers need to be reminded that their lessons endure. Sometimes the echo is the proof. They called it the second Omega. The name started as a whisper, first among the sailors of the Vigilance, then across the entire strike group. It spread like wildfire, carried by encrypted messages, off-duty conversations, and late-night wardroom stories. No one could quite describe what had happened, only what it felt like. The impossible unfolding quietly in real time. No shouting, no panic, just control, just calm. In the Navy, stories mutate, details shift, heroes become myths, but this one stayed mostly intact, maybe because the truth itself was powerful enough. A destroyer had faced an overwhelming saturation strike, the kind no tactical simulation ever predicted anyone could survive, and walked away untouched. No casualties, no damage, no noise. The reports went up the chain faster than protocol allowed. The official documents credited exceptional training and leadership under Commander Rex Thorne. But among the sailors, they used a different phrase. They called it the quiet victory. For Thorne, the days that followed felt heavier than the battle itself. Command meant nothing without reflection, and reflection, he'd learned, carried its own weight. He spent hours reviewing every decision, every calculation, every pause. He wasn't looking for errors. He was looking for meaning, for the thread that tied all of it together. In every log, he saw her fingerprints, not literally but in spirit. The calm between orders, the stillness before movement, the patience before execution. Everything he'd done right had been borrowed from Admiral Hayes. But there was something he couldn't shake, a question that gnawed at him like an unfinished sentence. Why had she chosen him? Why, after humiliating him so completely, had she decided he was worth another chance? He thought about it often during those long, quiet nights in Norfolk, but now, after the real Omega, it haunted him differently. There had to be a reason beyond pity or professional courtesy. Maybe redemption wasn't what she gave him. Maybe it was what she needed him to find, so she could believe the system still worked. Admiral Evelyn Hayes stared at the ocean from the balcony of her Washington office. She rarely looked out the window, but tonight the horizon seemed alive, faint glimmers of lightning flashing far out at sea. The after-action report from the Vigilance lay on her desk, its edges slightly curled. She'd read it 3 times already, not because she doubted the content, but because she didn't quite know how to feel. For the first time in decades, she felt old. Not weak, not tired, just mortal. She'd spent her career shaping doctrines, designing simulations, building systems that would outlast her. But systems don't feel. People do. And sometimes people needed to learn in ways she could no longer teach. When she'd sent Thorne back to the Vigilance, she hadn't been certain he'd pass. No one ever really passes Omega. It isn't that kind of test. It's not about victory. It's about revelation, about who you become under pressure. And he'd become exactly what she'd hoped for, quiet, steady, unshakable. She should have been proud. She was proud. But pride had an edge to it, sharp and bittersweet. Because when a student's lesson ends, a teacher's purpose begins to fade. Hayes picked up the report again and traced a single line with her finger. Result: flawless defense, 0 casualties. She whispered softly, "Good work, Commander." Then, after a pause that carried years of unspoken memory, "Good work, Evelyn." Sometimes she still needed to remind herself that she was allowed to rest. The next time her secure line buzzed, she almost ignored it, but the voice on the other end was steady, familiar. "Captain Rostova, Admiral, you'll want to see this." Hayes frowned. "Go ahead." "Fleet Command wants to replicate Omega 7. They're calling it Project Athena, training protocol based on what happened aboard Vigilance. They want to standardize it." The irony made Hayes laugh quietly. They want to turn humility into curriculum. "Yes, ma'am," Rostova replied. "They want you to lead it." Hayes was silent for a long moment, and Thorne. "He doesn't know yet," Rostova said, But if they approve the plan, he'll be assigned as the field instructor. That made the Admiral pause. That's a good choice. Rostova hesitated, then added, he speaks of you, you know. Not often, but when he does, it's with respect. The quiet kind. Hayes smiled faintly. That's the only kind that matters. On the Vigilance, dawn broke over a calm sea. The light bled gold across the horizon, painting the deck in soft amber. Commander Thorne stood outside the CIC, coffee in hand, the ocean wind cutting through the thin fabric of his uniform. He'd slept little. The battle replayed in his dreams not as chaos but as silence, the kind that hums right before impact. He'd woken each time to the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He wasn't haunted. He was aware. Rostova joined him, her expression unreadable. Fleet Command just sent orders, she said. He turned slightly. Ma'am. We're returning to port. Debrief in person. They want your full tactical log. He nodded, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. They also requested your temporary reassignment, she added quietly. Project Athena. You'll train new officers in crisis command protocols, under Admiral Hayes' oversight. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, his eyes on the horizon. I see, he said finally. She specifically requested you, Commander. That caught him. He turned. She did. Yes, Rostova said. And if you want my opinion, she's not done teaching you. He smiled slightly, a touch of humility in it. Then maybe I'm not done learning. Rostova's gaze softened. You did good, Rex. She was proud of you. We all were. He nodded once, eyes distant. Let's make sure she stays proud. 2 weeks later, the massive training auditorium at the Naval War College buzzed with muted anticipation. Hundreds of young officers sat in neat rows, data pads glowing in their hands. They expected a lecture, maybe a slideshow, maybe a speech about tactics. What they got instead was silence. The door opened and 2 figures entered. One moved slowly but deliberately, an older woman with gray-streaked hair, her posture straight as a blade. The other walked with quiet confidence, his uniform crisp, his expression calm. Admiral Evelyn Hayes, Commander Rex Thorne. They didn't stand at the podium right away. They simply stood there side by side, watching, listening. Then Hayes spoke. Does anyone know what the hardest part of leadership is? A few hands rose. She pointed to a young lieutenant in the 3rd row. Making decisions under pressure, he offered. Hayes shook her head gently. No, the hardest part is learning when not to speak. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She gestured to Thorne. This man once believed command meant volume. That control meant shouting loud enough to drown out fear. He was wrong. And I'm grateful he was, because when he learned to listen, he became the kind of leader every one of you should aspire to be. Thorne stepped forward. His eyes scanned the crowd. He didn't need notes. His voice was calm, clear, steady. Leadership, he said, isn't about certainty. It's about clarity. When everything goes wrong, your crew doesn't need you to be loud. They need you to see. He paused, letting that settle. When I froze under pressure, she didn't humiliate me. She let me humiliate myself so I could learn that lesson. And I did, the hard way. The young officers were silent now, their attention fixed. Hayes smiled faintly. Simulation Omega-7 was designed to be impossible. He beat it twice. The first time by accident, the second time by understanding. She turned to him. Tell them what you understood, Commander. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the moment felt like a closing circle. I understood, he said slowly. That power isn't something you project, it's something you protect, and the best way to protect it is through competence. Hayes nodded, and humility. Yes, ma'am, he said, that too. The class erupted into quiet applause, not thunderous, not performative, just steady. Hayes raised a hand, silencing them gently. Remember this, she said. Someday, When it's your turn, you'll find yourself in a room where panic feels like the only language left. That's when you'll understand what silence really means." She stepped back, class dismissed. As the cadets filed out, whispering to one another, Thorne turned to her. "You didn't have to share that," he said quietly. "My failure." She looked up at him, eyes glinting with something close to affection. "Your failure was the most useful thing you ever gave them." He smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. Later, as the auditorium emptied and the lights dimmed, Hayes lingered by the stage. Her hands rested lightly on the railing. Thorne joined her, both of them staring at the rows of empty seats. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The noise," she replied. "No, the quiet always." They stood there for a long time. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the wide glass windows. The sound was soft, rhythmic, alive. She sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think my job was to create perfect officers. Now I think it's to make flawed ones who learn." Thorne looked down at her. "You succeeded, Admiral." She turned her head, eyes finding his. "Don't call me Admiral when you say that." He hesitated. "Then what should I call you?" She smiled faintly. "Just Evelyn." He nodded. "Thank you, Evelyn." The words carried weight, not rank, not ceremony, just truth. As they walked out together into the rain, neither spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they'd both survived, everything they'd both learned, everything they had finally understood. Sometimes respect doesn't come from command. It comes from reflection. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply stands there quietly, unshakably, and lets the world listen. It began quietly, the way endings always do. Admiral Evelyn Hayes stopped showing up at Fleet Command as often. Her staff assumed it was fatigue or the inevitable bureaucracy that came with senior rank. But those who knew her, the few who really saw her, understood. She wasn't slowing down, she was stepping aside. Decades in uniform leave marks no one can see, scars under medals, silence under speeches. She had spent her life making sure others were ready for command. Now she was preparing herself to let go of it. Every generation must yield to the next, but letting go is harder than combat. She stood before the mirror in her quarters one morning, adjusting her collar with practiced precision. The face staring back was still sharp, still controlled, but there were shadows in her eyes now, small reminders that even steel bends under time. Her aide knocked. "Ma'am, the Board of Admiralty awaits you in Conference Room 3. Hayes glanced at the reflection one last time, then whispered softly, "Let's finish this right." Commander Rex Thorne sat in the cafeteria of the Naval War College, watching the morning light stretch across the glass floor. A few cadets nodded to him as they passed. Some saluted. Others just whispered his name with a kind of hushed reverence. He'd become a living case study, a man who had failed, learned, returned, and rewritten what leadership meant. But the attention never sat easily with him. He preferred quiet corners, the kind where reflection had space to breathe. On the table before him lay a message, still unopened. Fleet Command encryption, bearing Hayes' seal. He stared at it for a long time before pressing his thumb to the reader. The holographic text appeared instantly. "Commander Thorne requesting your presence at Fleet Headquarters, 700 hours tomorrow. Bring no escort. Admiral Evelyn Hayes." He read it twice, then a third time before the meaning settled. She wasn't summoning him for protocol. This was personal. He sat back in his chair, heart steady but heavy. Something in the tone of her message told him this wasn't about training or commendations. It was about closure. The next morning he arrived early. The building felt different this time, quieter, almost reverent. The walls carried the faint hum of memory. When he entered Conference Room 3, Hayes was already there, standing by the window overlooking the Potomac. Her uniform was immaculate, her presence unshaken. She didn't turn right away. "You came early," she said. "I've learned it's better to arrive before the storm," he replied gently. She smiled faintly, always the tactical mind. When she turned, he noticed the subtle fatigue around her eyes. It wasn't weakness, it was peace. "Sit Rex," she said. He obeyed, though the word Rex caught him off guard. She had never called him by his first name before. "I wanted to see you before the announcement," she began. "What announcement?" Her expression softened. "My retirement." The word landed between them like a quiet detonation. He opened his mouth, closed it again. "You're serious?" "I am," she said. 37 years in uniform. The Navy's been my blood, my purpose, my home. But there's a time to teach, and there's a time to let the students lead." He leaned forward slightly. "The fleet still needs you." She shook her head. "No, it needs people who remember what I tried to teach. That's you, Rex. That's Rostova. That's every officer who learned the language of quiet command." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the room filled the space between words. Finally, she said softly, "When I first met you, you reminded me of myself. Too certain, too loud. I saw your downfall before you did, but I also saw something else, something worth saving." He swallowed hard. "You didn't have to save me." "No," she said, "but I wanted to, because someone once saved me." That caught him. "You." She nodded, eyes distant. "I was you once. 24 years old, fresh out of OCS. I froze under fire. A captain, God rest his soul, stood beside me, calm as ever. He didn't yell, he just said, when everyone's shouting, listen to what isn't being said. I carried that for the rest of my life. Now I'm passing it to you." Thorne looked down, his throat tightening. "I won't forget." "I know," she said softly. She walked to the desk, opened a small drawer, and took out a single medal, a fleet command insignia edged in silver. She placed it before him. "This isn't official," she said. "It's personal, my own insignia from my first command. I want you to have it." He hesitated. "I can't accept." "Yes, you can," she interrupted gently. "Because it's not a gift, it's a reminder. The same lesson I carried, passed on to me, now passed to you." He took it carefully, the weight of the small piece of metal feeling far greater than its size. "Thank you, ma'am." Her voice softened. "It's Evelyn, remember." He smiled through the quiet ache in his chest. "Thank you, Evelyn." That evening, the announcement came through fleet channels. Admiral Evelyn Hayes, retiring from active duty after 37 years of distinguished service. The message spread through every corridor, every wardroom, every vessel in the fleet. Some officers paused to read it twice. Some saluted the screen out of habit. A few, the ones who truly understood, went silent. On the Vigilance, Captain Rostova stood on deck at dusk, hands clasped behind her back, the sea glimmering gold beneath the fading light. "She deserved better than a paragraph," she whispered. Beside her, Ensign Keller nodded quietly. "She didn't need a paragraph, ma'am. She left her mark in silence." Rostova smiled faintly. "You're learning." In Washington, the formal farewell was small, exactly how Hayes wanted it. No speeches, no parades, just a single ceremony in the courtyard of the Naval Memorial, under the stone engraved with the words, "Not for glory, but for duty." The sky was overcast, but the air was calm. Rows of officers stood in formation, their uniforms immaculate, their faces solemn. When Hayes stepped to the podium, there was no fanfare, just a soft rustle as everyone came to attention. She looked out at them, the generations she had trained, the fleet she had built, the echoes of her own youth in their eyes. "I'm not going to talk about accomplishments," she began, her voice clear but quiet. "You can read those in history books. What matters isn't what we do, it's what we leave behind." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd until it settled on Thorne. "When I joined, I thought strength was about control. Over time, I learned it's about composure. The difference is simple. Control forces things to obey you. Composure inspires them to follow. Her hand rested briefly on the podium. I hope every one of you remembers that when the storm comes, because it will. Silence. Then almost imperceptibly she smiled. And when it does, don't shout. Just breathe. You'll be surprised how many lives can be saved by one moment of silence. She stepped back. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The stillness said everything. Later, when the courtyard had emptied, Hayes lingered alone among the marble walls. The wind rustled softly through the trees. Thorne approached quietly, his shoes echoing against the stone. He stopped beside her, both of them facing the memorial. Fleet Command approved the Omega Doctrine, he said. They're building an entire training division around it. Hayes's lips curved into a small, proud smile. Good, then the lesson will outlive us. Us, he echoed. She nodded. You think I'm done, but I'm not. I'll keep teaching, just not here. He studied her profile against the gray sky. Then where? She looked upward, thoughtful. Anywhere someone's still listening. They stood in silence for a while. The flag above them fluttered in the wind, its movement soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Thorne finally said, You once told me redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. She turned to him, her eyes kind. It's about what you build from them. He nodded. Then I think we built something worth remembering. She smiled. We did. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the silver insignia she'd given him earlier. The metal glinted faintly in the fading light. I'll carry this, he said, until someone else earns it. She nodded once, then the circle will stay unbroken. For a long time, neither spoke. The sky began to darken, the city lights flickering to life in the distance. Hayes took one last look at the memorial, then at him. Take care of them, she said softly. The next generation, the quiet ones, they're the future now. He met her gaze. I will. She turned, started walking toward the gate. Her steps were slow but steady. As she disappeared into the soft gray light, Thorne felt something in the air shift, like the faint hum before a storm or the stillness before dawn. She was gone. But her voice, her calm, her lesson, those would stay. Forever. That night Thorne stood alone aboard the Vigilance, now docked at Norfolk. The ship was quiet, the crew on shore leave. Only the ocean spoke, waves lapping gently against the hull. He placed the insignia on the quiet console. For a moment, it caught the light, reflecting it across the screens like a silent flare. He whispered, You taught us to listen, now we will. The lights dimmed slowly, leaving only the soft glow of the console. Outside, the horizon stretched infinite and dark, waiting for morning. And deep inside that stillness, Rex Thorne smiled, quietly, resolutely, knowing that some legacies don't echo in sound. They echo in silence. The deck was silent. Only the ocean moved, slow and alive beneath the Vigilance. Rex Thorne stood at the edge of the flight line, the insignia of Admiral Hayes resting on the quiet console behind him. The night wind pressed against his uniform. Somewhere far below, the waves broke against steel. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The ship seemed to breathe with him, a living thing that remembered everything it had witnessed. The calm before the old admiral's retirement speech, the chaos of Omega, the silence afterward. Now it was all still again. He stayed there until the horizon began to fade from black to gray. The first hint of dawn, a pale light that touched the water like forgiveness. That was when the encrypted message arrived. A single chime echoed from the console. He turned, walked back, and tapped the display. Priority transmission from Admiral Hayes, Ret. Subject: When the sea is quiet. He hesitated before opening it. Her signature code should have been deactivated with her retirement. Somehow, she'd made sure this one last message would find him anyway. He pressed play. The screen filled with her image, recorded weeks ago, judging by the softer light behind her. She wasn't in uniform. Civilian clothes, plain and neat, but her posture was the same, straight, composed, calm. Her voice came through low and even, the way he remembered it. "Rex, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone or soon will be. Don't let that weigh on you. We all have our stations, and mine was never meant to last forever." He exhaled slowly, a hand bracing the edge of the console. "You were the last student I taught directly," she continued. "Maybe that's why I watched you so closely. I needed to know that the fleet could still learn, still listen. When you did, I knew the doctrine would outlive me." A faint smile touched her lips. "They'll name buildings after me. That's how the Navy works. But that's not legacy, Rex. Legacy is a habit someone practices when no one's watching. You carry that now. Every quiet decision you make, every calm word before a storm, that's me, still here." The message paused, as if she'd looked away. When she turned back, her eyes were softer. "One day you'll have your own student, someone who mistakes noise for power. Let them fail safely. Then teach them what silence can do. That's the only repayment I want." Her image flickered slightly. The message was almost done. "When the sea is quiet, that's when she's strongest. Remember that. And remember, sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." The screen went dark. Thorne stood there for a long time, letting the hum of the ship fill the void she left behind. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Aye, Admiral." 2 years later, the Vigilance had been reassigned to reserve duty, her hull weathered by time and salt. Thorne now commanded her successor, the USS Meridian, a sleek, modern destroyer built with every lesson of Omega woven into her systems. Her CIC was quieter by design: reduced alarms, soft-toned communications, command lights dimmed to encourage focus. They called it the Quiet Bridge. Every recruit who rotated through her crew learned the same principle: volume doesn't equal control. The Navy had officially codified it as the Hayes-Thorne doctrine. A single line summarized it in the training manual. "In chaos, composure is the loudest command." Thorne never liked the name, but he never argued either. He only cared that the lesson survived. His new executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Cruz, was sharp, ambitious, and impatient, the same age he'd been when he first faced Hayes. She questioned everything, doubted silence, and pushed for action before understanding. He saw himself in her, and that made him patient. On the morning their first major deployment began, she joined him on deck as the Meridian cut through low fog. "Sir," she said, glancing at the horizon, "Fleet Command wants daily tactical updates. I've prepped briefings for 12-hour intervals." He nodded, "Good work." She hesitated, permission to speak freely. "Always. Sometimes I wonder if this whole quiet doctrine thing slows us down," she said. "The world's faster now. Drones, hypersonics, instant comms. Shouldn't leadership match that tempo?" Thorne smiled slightly. "Speed without clarity is chaos. Chaos gets people killed. The sea hasn't changed, Lieutenant. She still punishes those who shout at her." Cruz folded her arms, unconvinced. "Maybe, but silence can look like hesitation." He met her gaze, calm. "Only if you don't know what you're listening for." She didn't answer, not yet. 4 days later, the Meridian entered contested waters under a multinational convoy escort. The operation seemed routine, until it was. At 2:20, every comm channel went dead. Satellites blacked out. GPS jittered into nonsense. Radar screens filled with static. An electromagnetic silence blanketed the entire region. Cruz rushed into the CIC, eyes wide. "Sir, total blackout. We've lost fleet net and satellite guidance." Thorne moved to the central console, hand steady. "Damage?" "None. Systems are fine. It's external interference. We're blind." The air thickened with unease. Officers glanced at one another. The convoy outside, 6 civilian freighters, 2 Allied frigates, was depending on them. Cruz whispered, "What do we do, sir?" Thorne looked around the dimly lit room. The quiet buzzed in his ears like electricity. He remembered Hayes's letter. When the sea is quiet, that's when she's strongest. "First," he said, "we stop trying to make noise." He turned to communications. "Cease transmission attempts. They'll only make us targets. Passive sensors only. You log the interference pattern." The crew obeyed instantly. The chatter dropped away, replaced by concentration. "Navigation," he said. "Switch to optical tracking. Use the old lenses." Cruz blinked. "Manual navigation." "Exactly. The sky still works, even when satellites don't." They recalibrated against the stars. Minutes crawled by. The interference pulsed in strange waves, rhythmic, almost intentional. "You isolate the pattern," Thorne ordered. The technician frowned. "It's repeating every 42 seconds, like sonar pings but digital." Thorne's stomach tightened. "It's a trap." "Sir?" "They're hurting us, forcing the convoy to compress into a smaller area. Someone out there wants us blind and bunched." Cruz stepped closer. "Orders?" "None yet," he said quietly. "Let's listen first." He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the vibrations through the deck plates. The faint hum of engines, the soft hiss of air systems, the heartbeat of the ship. Then it clicked. The interference wasn't uniform. It had gaps, like breath marks in a sentence. Whoever was jamming them didn't realize their timing betrayed position. He opened his eyes. "Plot the signal intervals on a bearing map, every pulse, every gap." Cruz watched as the pattern appeared, an arc of invisible pressure moving from port to starboard. "Contact probable within that sector," he said. "A sub or a drone ship using reflection jamming. Either way, it's hunting." Cruz's voice dropped. "Then we should strike first." He shook his head. "No, we wait. They'll reveal themselves when they think we're lost." The room held its breath. Minutes stretched. The interference wavered, then spiked. "Target lock detected," Yeo shouted. Cruz turned. "Sir." Thorne didn't raise his voice. "Deploy decoy buoys, 2 only, no sonar ping. Let them think we're maneuvering blind." The technician complied. The buoys launched silently, drifting on the surface. Seconds later, a torpedo wake slashed through the water, aimed straight at the decoys. "Impact negative on hull contact," navigation confirmed. The bridge erupted in low murmurs. Thorne lifted a hand for silence. "Now," he said, "helm 10 degrees starboard, engines at quarter, prepare acoustic charge on my mark." Cruz leaned in. "You mean to fight back?" He looked at her calm as the tide. "To answer, Lieutenant," quietly. The torpedo missed again, this time because the meridian wasn't where the enemy expected. Thorne waited until the jamming peaked, then gave a single nod. "Mark." A low-frequency pulse rolled out from the ship, invisible but deep enough to shake the bulkheads. The interference vanished. On the scope, a faint shape flickered, an unmanned stealth sub, surfacing under force system reboot. Cruz exhaled. "You disabled it." He smiled faintly. "No, I let it disable itself." For a moment the crew was too stunned to speak. Then quiet applause broke out, light, restrained, proud. Thorne raised a hand. "Save it. The sea isn't done testing us yet." Cruz nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "So that's what you meant by listening." "That's what she meant," he corrected gently. Hours later the convoy was safe, the blackout lifted, and Fleet Command restored communication. The official report would call it a minor encounter resolved through tactical restraint. But those aboard knew better. They witnessed the doctrine at work. That evening Cruz joined Thorne on deck. The sun was setting, gold fatting into violet across the water. "Sir," she said quietly, "may I ask something?" "Of course." When Admiral Hayes died, what did she say to you? I mean, really say. He thought about lying, keeping it private, but the sea around them deserved honesty. He took a folded printout from his pocket, the transcript of her final message. The edges were worn from years of rereading. She said, he began softly, that legacy isn't in medals or manuals. It's in habits repeated when no one's watching. And that silence isn't emptiness. It's clarity. Cruz studied him for a moment, then looked back at the water. I think I understand. He smiled. You will. Someday when the noise starts and you find yourself listening instead of shouting, that's when you'll understand completely. They stood side by side as darkness fell, the ship's lights shimmering over gentle waves. Far below, the sea whispered against the hull, a quiet voice eternal. Weeks later, a letter arrived for Thorne from Fleet Archives. Inside was a single page. Authorization for declassification, Omega-7 program. Effective immediately. Training materials to be preserved at Naval Memorial under the title, The Quiet Doctrine. He read it twice, then placed it beside Hayes's old insignia. The circle was complete. That night he walked the deck alone again, same as before, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt alive, with memory, with purpose, with the pulse of every sailor who'd learned to breathe instead of break. He looked toward the horizon where sky met water, whispered a final salute. Fair winds, Admiral. The sea answered, not with sound but with stillness. And in that stillness lived everything she had ever taught.